They say the human brain is hardwired to ignore the irrelevant. It filters out the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rhythm of traffic, the sound of your own breathing. It is a survival mechanism, a way to keep you sane in a world overflowing with sensory noise. But what happens when the brain stops filtering? What happens when that silence, that heavy, suffocating stillness of a midnight room, is broken by something that shouldn't be there? A sound that doesn't belong to the wind, or the house settling, or the ghosts of your own anxiety. If you are listening to this, if you are sitting in the dark right now, I want you to do something for me. Don't look behind you, no matter how much your neck itches, no matter how certain you are that you are alone. Because once you acknowledge the whisper, the rules change. And rule number 4 is the only thing standing between you and something that has been waiting a very, very long time to be noticed. It started with a simple list. Not a list of instructions for a game or a guide to surviving a forest, but a scrap of paper found in the lining of an old coat. It was handwritten. The ink faded to a bruised purple, the handwriting frantic, as if the writer's hand had been shaking even as the pen touched the paper. There were no names, no dates, just a series of imperatives. Rule 1. Never leave the lights off for more than 10 minutes. Rule 2. If you see a shadow move against the grain of the light, ignore it. Rule 3. Do not answer if someone calls your name from a room you know is empty. And then, the one that felt less like a rule and more like a warning from a dying man. Rule 4. Do not turn around when you hear a whisper. At first, I thought it was a joke. A piece of modern folklore. Some creepypasta meant to scare teenagers on late-night forums. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud in my studio apartment. A space so small that every sound echoed, making the joke feel even more absurd. I am a man of logic. I deal in facts, in tangible realities, in things I can touch and measure. Whispers in the dark are just acoustics. They are sound waves bouncing off drywall and cheap furniture. They are the wind catching a gap in the windowsill. There is no such thing as a rule for something that doesn't exist. But logic is a fragile shield when the atmosphere begins to shift. It began on a Tuesday, a mundane, unremarkable Tuesday. The kind of day that disappears from your memory the moment it ends. I was working late. The blue light of my monitor, the only thing carving a sanctuary out of the darkness of my room. The clock read 2:14 a.m. The silence was absolute. That heavy, pressurized silence that feels like it's pushing against your eardrums. And then I heard it. It wasn't a loud sound. It wasn't a bang or a crash. It was a soft, dry friction of air. A sibilant sound, right against the shell of my ear. Help me. It was so faint I thought I had hallucinated it. I froze. My heart didn't race immediately. Instead, it seemed to stop, a sudden vacuum in my chest. I sat perfectly still, staring at the lines of code on my screen, waiting for my brain to correct the error. I told myself it was the radiator. I told myself it was a dream bleeding into wakefulness. But the air in the room had changed. It felt thicker, colder, as if the oxygen had been replaced by something denser, something more ancient. I kept my eyes fixed on the monitor. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Because in that moment, a primal, lizard brain instinct flared up inside me. It was an instinct that predates language, predates civilization. It was the feeling of being watched by something that has no eyes. It was the feeling of being prey. The whisper came again. This time it wasn't a plea. It was a name. My name. It wasn't spoken with a voice. It was spoken with the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. It was a breathy, hollow approximation of speech that seemed to originate from the empty space exactly 3 inches behind my left shoulder. Elias! My first instinct, the human instinct, was to whirl around, to face the threat, to confront the intruder, to demand to know who was there. My muscles tensed, my spine coiled like a spring, ready to snap into action. I wanted to see. I wanted to prove that there was nothing there. I wanted to turn around and laugh at the empty air, to reclaim my reality. But then, the memory of the paper flashed in my mind. Rule 4. Do not turn around. Why? Why would anyone write that? If there is something there, shouldn't you face it? If you face it, you can fight it. If you face it, you can run. But the rule didn't say fight. It didn't say run. It simply commanded silence and stillness. Commanded a refusal to acknowledge. I realized then that there is a difference between a physical threat and a perceptual one. A man with a knife is a physical threat. You can run from him. But what if the threat exists only in the moment of recognition? What if the act of turning around is the very thing that completes the circuit? What if the whisper is a hook, and your gaze is the line that pulls the thing into this world? I sat there, paralyzed, staring at my screen, while the shadow of my own head cast a long, trembling shape against the wall. I could feel the presence. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a weight, a presence so heavy it felt like the gravity in the room had shifted toward that empty corner behind me. I could feel the heat, or perhaps the lack of it, radiating from the space where nothing should be. I waited for the sound of footsteps. I waited for the creak of a floorboard. I waited for the touch of a hand on my shoulder. But there was only the whisper, growing more frequent, more rhythmic, like a tide coming in. Turn around. Elias, Sas. The us hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't a lone specter or a stray ghost. It was a collective, a crowd of whispers, a congregation of things waiting in the periphery. In that moment, I understood the terrifying nature of the rule. Rule 4 isn't about bravery. It isn't about being a hero. It is about the desperate, agonizing discipline of ignoring the impossible. It is about the terror of knowing that something is standing right behind you, breathing on your neck, and knowing that the moment you grant it the dignity of your attention, you are no longer the observer. You become the observed. You become the prey. I stared at my monitor until my eyes burned, until the characters on the screen blurred into meaningless gray shapes. I didn't turn. I didn't move. I stayed in that frozen state of hyper-awareness, a prisoner of my own refusal to look. And that was when I realized the true horror of the situation. The whisper wasn't trying to scare me away. It wasn't trying to frighten me. It was trying to invite me in. The silence that followed that invitation was worse than the whisper itself. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that precedes a lightning strike or the sudden plunge of a roller coaster. My eyes were stinging, my vision blurring from the strain of staring at the monitor, but I refused to let my gaze wander. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed my intellect and went straight to my marrow, that if I let my eyes drift toward the reflection in the dark glass of my computer screen, I would see it. I would see the shape that was leaning over me. I tried to breathe, but my lungs felt shallow, as if the very air had become too thin to sustain life. I practiced a technique I had once read about in a psychology journal, grounding. I tried to name 5 things I could see: the glowing cursor, the edge of my keyboard, the half-empty coffee mug, the corner of a book, the power strip on the floor. But as I went through the list, the objects seemed wrong. They looked like props in a play, fragile and artificial, as if the reality of the room was beginning to fray at the edges. The grounding failed because you cannot ground yourself in a world that is no longer stable. A new sound began to emerge from the stillness. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a rhythmic, wet sound. Schlick, schlick, schlick. It sounded like something damp being dragged across the carpet. It was moving. It was circling me. My mind raced, trying to find a logical anchor. It's the pipes, I told myself. It's a leak in the ceiling. It's a rat in the walls. But the sound was too deliberate. It had a cadence. It was moving in a slow, predatory arc, staying just outside my field of vision, staying precisely in that blind spot where my peripheral vision fails. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream, not out of fear, but out of a desperate need to break the tension, to shatter the atmosphere with a sound of my own making. I wanted to roar at the darkness, to demand that it show itself so I could finally deal with it. But I held it in. I knew instinctively that a scream is a form of acknowledgement. A scream is a signal that you have heard them, that you are afraid, and that you are ready to play. As the dragging sound continued, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my own breath blooming in the light of the monitor, a pale, ghostly mist. The cold wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was an invasive, biting chill that seemed to sink past my skin and settle directly into my bones. Then the whispers returned, but they had changed. They were no longer individual voices. They had merged into a low, dissonant hum, a vibration that I felt in my teeth more than I heard in my ears. It was the sound of 1,000 voices speaking at once. All of them hushed, all of them urgent, all of them directed at me. Look! 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 The command was relentless. It wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a psychic pressure, a weight pressing against the back of my skull, urging me to turn, to succumb, to give in to the curiosity that is the hallmark of our species. We are a species defined by our need to see, to know, to uncover. We have spent millennia pushing back the darkness with fire and light, driven by the maddening itch of the unknown. And that is exactly what they are counting on. They are using our own evolution against us. They are using our curiosity as a doorway. I thought about the people who had lived in this apartment before me. I thought about the history of this building, the city, the land. Was this a localized haunting? A glitch in the fabric of this specific space? Or was this something more fundamental? Something that exists in the gaps between atoms, in the shadows between thoughts? If Rule 4 is real, then it implies that these things, the whispers, the shadows, the in presences, are not merely ghosts. Ghosts are remnants of the past. These things felt much more present. They felt like predators that exist in a different frequency, waiting for a moment of synchronicity to bridge the gap between their world and ours. They don't want to haunt us. They want to join us. Or rather, they want to pull us into them. The dragging sound stopped. The hum died down. The room became so silent that I could hear the blood rushing through my own carotid artery. A frantic, rhythmic thudding that felt like a drumbeat in a tomb. I was alone in the center of a void. And then I felt it, a sensation of warmth. Not the warmth of life, but the localized, sickening heat of a breath being exhaled against the nape of my neck. It was slow, heavy, and smelled faintly of something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. I froze so violently I thought my muscles might tear. My eyes were wide, fixed on the screen, but my entire consciousness was concentrated on that single point of contact on my skin. The breath lingered. It stayed there, a hot, invisible weight, as if whatever was behind me was leaning in, savoring the moment, watching the back of my head with an intensity that was almost tactile. I realized then that the danger wasn't in the turning. The danger was in the almost. The danger was in that split second of indecision, that momentary lapse in willpower where you think, just one look, just to be sure. The whisper came one last time, but it wasn't a sound. It was a thought that appeared in my mind, unbidden and terrifyingly clear. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone else's. It was just a cold, hard fact that sat in my consciousness like a stone. You're already looking. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My heart hammered against my ribs. If I hadn't turned my head, how could it say that? How could it know that I was, in every way that mattered, already looking? Because even without moving my eyes, even without turning my body, I had acknowledged them. I had felt them. I had listened to them. I had given them the one thing they needed to bridge the gap. My attention. The rule wasn't just about the physical act of turning around. The rule was about the mental act of recognition. The moment you realize you are not alone, you have already broken the rule. Suddenly, the light of the monitor flickered. The blue glow turned a sickly, bruised violet, the same color as the ink on the scrap of paper. The pixels began to dance and distort, forming shapes that looked like grasping hands, like faces twisted in silent screams. And then the power went out. The darkness that rushed in was not merely the absence of light. It was absolute. It was a thick, velvety blackness that felt like it had mass. A darkness that filled my mouth and my nostrils, making it impossible to tell where my body ended and the room began. I sat in the total, crushing dark, my heart a panicked animal trapped in a cage. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face. I couldn't see the desk. I was suspended in a void, a single point of consciousness in an ocean of nothingness. And then, In the darkness, I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Not my chair. The sound came from the corner of the room, where there was nothing but empty space. It was the sound of someone sitting down, someone very close. And then, the whisper, right in my ear, so close I could feel the vibration in my jaw. Now, let's play. The darkness wasn't empty. It was crowded. In the total absence of light, my other senses didn't just sharpen. They mutated. Every sound became a physical blow. The sound of my own panicked breathing felt deafening, like a bellows in a cathedral. The smell of the room had changed completely. The stale coffee and dust were gone, replaced by the cloying, heavy scent of ozone and wet earth, as if a thunderstorm had just broken in a graveyard. I didn't move, couldn't. Every instinct for survival screamed at me to bolt, to run blindly into the hallway, to find the light, to find anything that felt real. But I knew that movement in this darkness was a gamble I couldn't afford to lose. If there was something sitting in that corner, something that had just settled in, then any sudden movement would be an invitation to be touched. Now, let's play. The voice hadn't been a voice. It was a vibration that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. It was a command disguised as an offer. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure on my shoulder. It wasn't a hand. It felt like something thin and cold, like a strand of wire or a piece of dry skin, pressing firmly into my trapezius muscle. It didn't push. It just rested there, marking me. It was an anchor, tethering me to the thing that was now sitting just inches away. I realized then that the game wasn't something with rules and winners. The game was the process of erosion. They weren't trying to kill me. Not yet. They were trying to wear down the boundaries of my reality until there was no distinction left between my world and theirs. They were peeling me away from the light, layer by layer. I forced myself to try and reach for my phone. It was on the desk, just a few inches to my right. My hand moved through the void, trembling so violently that I feared the movement would be too loud. My fingers brushed the cool, smooth surface of the desk. I felt the edge of the phone. My heart was a frantic, jagged rhythm in my chest. Don't reach. The thought wasn't mine. It was a cold, intrusive whisper that seemed to come from the very air around me. If you turn on the light, the game ends. And if the game ends, you go back to being alone. Do you really want to be alone again? The psychological cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. It played on the most primal human fear, the fear of the void, the fear of isolation. They were offering me company, even if that company was monstrous. They were offering a connection, even if that connection was predatory. My fingers gripped the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. One tap, one single motion, and the screen would flare to life, casting a brilliant, artificial glow that would shatter the darkness and, hopefully, drive them back. But as I prepared to press, I felt the pressure on my shoulder shift. The cold, thin thing began to slide. It moved slowly, agonizingly, from my shoulder up toward my neck, tracing the line of my jaw. It was accompanied by a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like the mandibles of an insect or the clicking of long, bony fingers against each other. Click, click, click. I stopped. I froze. The phone felt like a hot coal in my hand. In that moment of hesitation, the darkness itself seemed to pulse. I felt a sensation of being watched by hundreds of eyes, not from the room, but from within the darkness itself. The shadows weren't just absences of light. They were presences. They were thick, gelatinous entities that were swirling around me, closing the circle. Then, a new sensation, the feeling of being lifted. It was subtle at first, a slight loss of weight in my seat. My chair wasn't being pushed. It was being hoisted. The floor beneath me felt distant. As the very gravity of the room had shifted. I was being pulled upward, not into the air, but into the dark. I tried to scream, but my throat was paralyzed. I tried to struggle, but my limbs felt like they were made of lead. I was a passenger in my own body, a witness to my own abduction. And then the darkness began to change. It wasn't black anymore. It was becoming translucent. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I could see shapes. Vast, undulating shapes that moved with a slow, hypnotic grace. They looked like deep-sea creatures, translucent and glowing with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. They were drifting through the air of my apartment as if it were an ocean. And among them I saw it. The thing that had been leaning over me. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a ghost. It was a silhouette of something that defied geometry. It had limbs that were too long, joints that bent in directions that made my stomach churn, and a head that seemed to fold into itself. It wasn't made of matter. It was made of a density that the light simply couldn't penetrate. It was moving toward me, its movements synchronized with the rhythmic clicking. It wasn't walking. It was unfolding itself through the space. As it drew closer, the temperature didn't just drop. It vanished. I entered a state of absolute zero, a cold so intense that it felt like heat. My skin felt like it was cracking. My breath didn't just mist. It froze in the air, tiny crystals of ice suspended in the void. The entity was inches away now. I could see the faint, pulsing light of its internal structure. It was a labyrinth of veins and hollow spaces, a nightmare of biological impossibility. It leaned in. The clicking stopped. It didn't use its mouth to speak. It didn't have a mouth. Instead, it pressed its face. A flat, featureless plane of dark matter against mine. The contact was an explosion. It wasn't a physical sensation. It was a data dump. A torrent of sensory information, of memories that weren't mine, of sights that no human eye was meant to process. I saw stars dying in great, silent bursts of violet. I saw civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye. I saw the architecture of the universe, a complex, terrifying web of shadows and light. I saw the rules, the fundamental laws of existence, and the loopholes that allowed them to exist. The information was too much. It was a hammer blow to my consciousness. My mind began to fracture under the weight of it. I felt my sense of self, my name, my history, my very existence, begin to dissolve, to be swept away in the tide of this alien knowledge. And in that moment of dissolution, I realized the true nature of the game. The game wasn't about survival. It wasn't about fear. The game was about integration. They weren't killing me. They were rewriting me. They were using the breach I had created by noticing them to overwrite my reality with theirs. I wasn't being hunted. I was being colonized. As my consciousness flickered like a dying candle, I felt a final, terrifying thought bloom in the wreckage of my mind. It was a realization that was both the end of my life and the beginning of something else. The light was never the protection. The light was the veil. The darkness rushed in to fill the gaps in my mind, and for the first time, I didn't fight it. Couldn't. I simply became. The alarm clock on the bedside table chirped at 7 a.m. It was a cheerful, mundane sound, utterly out of place in a world that had, only hours before, been unmade. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, cutting clean, golden lines through the dust motes dancing in the air. The apartment was silent. The smell of stale coffee was back. The ozone was gone. Everything was exactly as it should be. I sat up in bed. The sheets were rumpled, the pillows indented. I felt the weight of my limbs, the familiar ache in my lower back, the dry scratchiness of my throat. I was alive. I was in my room. I was me. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. It was there, the screen dark. I pressed the power button, and the bright, artificial glow illuminated my face. Felt normal. Felt safe. I stood up and walked to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. I avoided the mirror for a long time. I didn't want to see the person who had survived the night. I wanted to believe that the person who went to sleep was the same person who had woken up. When I finally forced myself to look, I breathed a sigh of relief. I looked the same. The same tired eyes, the same slight stubble, the same messy hair. I looked like a man who had simply had a long, restless night. I looked human. But then I reached for the towel. As my hand passed through a shaft of direct sunlight, I saw it. For a fraction of a second, my skin didn't just reflect the light. It absorbed it. There was no shadow cast by my hand on the porcelain sink. The light didn't bounce off my knuckles. It seemed to sink into them, disappearing into a void that shouldn't exist. I froze. I stared at my hand. I moved my fingers. The movement was fluid, perfect. But as I watched, I noticed a subtle, rhythmic pulse beneath the skin of my wrist. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was too slow, too steady, like the deep tectonic shifting of something massive and ancient. I turned toward the mirror, my heart hammering against my ribs. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the glass. I looked into my own eyes. They were brown. They were normal. But deep within the pupil, in the very center where the light should be most concentrated, there was something else. A tiny, microscopic flicker. A speck of violet light, pulsing in perfect synchronization with the rhythm in my wrist. It was a seed. A tiny, infinitesimal breach in the veil. I realized then that the integration hadn't been a complete overwrite. It hadn't been a total replacement. It had been an infection. They hadn't destroyed my reality. They had simply planted themselves within it. They were the passenger in my blood, the ghost in my synapses, the passenger in my soul. I walked back into the living room and sat on the sofa. I looked out the window at the street below. People were walking to work. Cars were driving by. The sun was shining. The world was loud, bright, and undeniably real. It was a beautiful lie. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to smile. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but of recognition. A profound, terrifying sense of belonging. I wasn't alone anymore. I would never be alone again. The darkness wasn't something outside, waiting in the corners of the room. The darkness was the foundation upon which my new world was being built. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, the sunlight felt cold. Click, click, click. The sound didn't come from the room, came from inside my head. And then I began to wait.